Welcome to Outside Ourselves. I am your host, Kelsi, and today's episode is a conversation with Dr. Anthony Bradley. Dr. Bradley is a professor and a theologian who has done an extensive amount of work researching and writing about the current problems facing men and young men in particular in our culture today. As you'll hear in today's conversation, Dr. Bradley knows the data really well when it comes to what is often called the boy crisis in America today. We are definitely going to get into what exactly that means and defining that crisis in today's episode, as well as where Dr. Bradley sees solutions specifically when it comes to the articulation of the gospel for these young men, and what that articulation, what the proclamation of the gospel actually does, so that not only young men, but all of us can live in the freedom and the forgiveness that is offered to us through Christ. So with that, here is today's episode with Dr. Anthony Bradley. Hi, Dr. Bradley. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's so good to see you and to get to chat.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to chatting. I've been following your work for a little bit and your Substack, and you've written some interesting things lately that I want to ask you specifically about. But before we kind of get into that, I would love if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and maybe your background, how you got into theology, and then what you're doing now.
Great. I'll start with now and then go back.
Perfect.
So I'm currently a research fellow at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm also a professor at Kuyper College here in Grand Rapids as well. Before that, I taught at the King's College in New York City for 14 years. I taught theology there. Before that, I taught at Covenant Seminary in St. Louis for 4 years. And I was also a student there after college. So I went to college at Clemson University. And then after Clemson, enrolled in Covenant Seminary, which is the denominational seminary for the Presbyterian Church in America. After graduating from Covenant Seminary, I then enrolled in Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, where I did a PhD in historical theology. And from there, I continued on with the sort of academic track. So I was finishing my dissertation here in Grand Rapids at the Acton Institute about 20 years ago. Can't believe it's been that long. And from there, went back to teach at Covenant Seminary in St. Louis and then to New York. And now I'm here. I've actually been using a lot of LCMS documents over the years. The book I published on race, I actually use the 1994 LCMS document on race because I think it's actually the best Protestant treatment of race in print.
Really?
So yeah, I will die on that hill. The 1994 LCMS document on race in the church or race relations in the church or something like that. Mm-hmm. You're not going to find anything better than that. It is.
Can you tell me a little bit about, because I'm unfamiliar with that document. I'd love to know like what you found in that LCMS document. That's super interesting.
Yes, I have a book called Aliens in the Promised Land, and I included that document in the appendix of that book because I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It does two things really well, maybe three things really well. One, it gives a really good history of kind of racial conflict in the states, particularly within a lot of Protestant contexts as well. It also does a good job of handling some of the theological issues that, as it relates to how Christians should be thinking about race as a social construction. And then thirdly, which I really appreciate about it, it also introduces some really good sociology. So it's not simply just a church document quoting a bunch of verses. You get really good history. You get good social science, but you also get good doctrine and theology mixed in. And there's just not a lot of denominational documents on race that do a good job of intersecting these disciplines the way the 1994 LCMS document does. So I've been using that document for years, and it's something that's really formed, kind of come to form and shape so much of my own work. If you have listeners who are in the LCMS, one of my best friends is John Nunez. He is a very well-known pastor in the LCMS. I was just with John a couple of months ago. I was speaking at his church in California. John and I go back about, I don't know, my goodness, 25 years or so. Oh, wow. So we've been partnering together on several projects over the years. So I'm very familiar. In fact, I was just on a podcast with Gene Edward Veith at Concordia Seminary. We were just talking about a recent article that he wrote. So I'm Lutheran adjacent and friendly. In fact, this is my last point. My current TA at Kuyper College is an LCMS member.
Okay.
And awesome. we're using an LCMS daily devotional in a group of students that we're having we have at Kuyper College. I think it's 75 years of devotions. It is a perfect devotional book for guys. Okay. It is perfect. It's absolutely brilliantly written, and it's simple, it's accessible, and it takes about 10 minutes.
Oh, that's great.
And for a college student and a guy who's Gen Z, who has an attention span of about 8 seconds, right? That type of devotional for a college student is great. It's 75 years of Lutheran devotions. And some of those devotions go back to the 1930s and 40s to the present. Cool. So it's just such a rich legacy of LCMS devotions.
Well, you just gave me a bunch of resources I've never heard about. So thank you for that. That's awesome. And that kind of gets us to a little bit about what I want to talk to you today, because I know you specialize, or you have a specific interest in writing about the problems facing men and young men in particular. And you do that, I think, in a way that mixes theology and sociology. You're not afraid to, and psychology, you're not afraid to look at the data and talk about issues, frame issues in that way, which I really appreciate. So I'm curious kind of where that interest began for you. Why did you start to get interested in that topic and start to write on it?
That's a fantastic question. So this for me began teaching at a Christian school in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And I was doing my PhD studies at Westminster, and as a part-time job, I taught 9th grade Old Testament to a group of high schoolers. I've always said, if you can teach 9th graders Old Testament, you can teach anybody anything, right? I mean, you can. I just want to say that for the record. And I noticed something in the high school. This is a high school that was founded by the same group of men that founded Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. So it has a rich tradition of very, very mature families sending their children to this particular school. And I began to notice something in the late 1990s that I just was curious about. One was, why is it that the girls were excelling at fantastic rates and paces? I mean, these girls were serious. They were driven.
Yeah.
They were competent. I mean, they had some clarity about their futures. I mean, they were just dialed in, and I thought, man, this is fantastic. These girls are great. But the boys, and this is in the late 1990s, the boys, I was like, and I did, by the way, I wasn't the only teacher that saw this. My colleagues saw this as well. We just saw the guys walking around the hall with their heads down, right? Walking slowly. Their shoulders were slumped over. Many of them not very motivated. Many of them had no idea what they were going to do with their futures. Not really. I mean, they wanted to get good grades. So they wanted to go to good college and that whole thing. But they just didn't seem to be really, as I said, for the girls, kind of dialed in and ambitious, right? Yeah. Really curious. They weren't really curious about a lot of things. So me and a couple of teachers got together and said, hey, we're going to open up a Bible study for boys at lunch on Wednesdays. It was a men's Bible study. quote unquote Bible study. So we open it up to all the ninth graders, because we were all ninth grade teachers. We open this up to all the ninth graders. And to our surprise, the last that we thought were going to show up didn't, right? So we opened this up thinking, well, guys who were from divorced families and the guys who were maybe from some trauma, right? Guys who were struggling. So the guys that we saw in this state, they were going to show up. And it was the opposite. The guys that showed up for the, hey, let's have a men's Bible study and try to figure life out together, were the boys of pastors and theologians and elders in their church. And they were the ones who were struggling. And we were like, wait, what is happening right now? And that, and meeting with those guys, there's probably 10 or so of them, meeting with them once a week that first year, it just opened me up to the world of boys, high school boys in particular. And I got introduced to the types of struggles that they had that I didn't know that they had from these really great families. And I thought, wow, something's really wrong here.
Interesting.
And that was the entryway into thinking about these issues for me. And then I just started to see data pop up. This is in the late 90s, data popping up about there was a book called Raising Cain. There's a PBS documentary about boys being almost undermined, if not attacked, downgraded in elementary schools, kind of K to sixth grade. Like boys were being penalized for being boys. Like if they were to draw a dragon, parents would be called in and say your boy's violent. So this stuff was beginning to happen in the late 1990s. So I was watching these students and reading this data, and I said, this is a problem. So I just committed myself that every institution that I would do whatever I could to make sure that the students that I came in contact with, especially the male students, were mentored, discipled, built up, encouraged to be the best men that they could be. I want to really make sure that they're marriage ready. I want to make sure they're ready for fatherhood. I want to make sure they're ready for a career. I want their confidence really, really high.
Yeah.
And in part, I want this for their future wives and children, right? And their grandchildren. So the way that I was thinking about it and still think about it today, if I can invest in 4 to 5 to 6 guys at a school, I'm actually impacting 3 generations of men and women out of their families, right? So, and so as I began to do that at every single school, I just began to see more and more struggles, more and more trauma, more and more resignation, and the data kept coming up, and I would hear these stories, and I'm comparing these two things, and I thought, wow, we have got to do something. And that was for me something that I stumbled into. It wasn't, I didn't really set out to do this, but just having that level of engagement with student stories and the data really made it something compelling for me.
I'm interested in this because I have 2 boys. They're toddlers right now, but I listened to The Boy Crisis, I think last year, which I found really interesting and compelling, and, have kind of stayed up to date a little bit on some of the research. So could you maybe define a little bit for us the problems that you see most of these young men facing? What are the problems, and what is the data kind of saying about the problems that they're facing?
Yeah, so if you've heard of the boy and man crisis, there's the Boy Crisis book. Richard Reeves has a book on boys and men that's become really, really popular. There are lots of books and articles on these things right now. We're seeing 2 major trends. One is that boys are now lagging girls in every subject, in every grade, at every school in America, period. It doesn't matter, 9th grade, 10th grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, math, science, whatever. Boys are lagging behind girls. We're also having a crisis of men who are disappearing from the workforce. So workforce participation, considered prime age for workforce participation, is between the age of 24 and 54. Okay. The most recent data I've seen is we have about 9 million men prime age that are not working.
Wow.
Now, what's interesting about this is they've dropped out of the economy altogether. So here's a good distinction. It's not that they're just not working. They're also not in college. They're not in trade schools. We have a trade shortage as well. So they've just disappeared. They're kind of off the grid. And if you look at male workforce participation, it's been on a steep decline really over the last decade and a half. It got precipitously worse after COVID. We just saw this major drop off, and it's still declining. So boys are trailing in school. We're looking at graduation rates that are on the decline as well for boys. College enrollment is another problem. Right now, as of the fall of 2021, about 60 to 61% of all incoming students were women.
Okay. As
of last year, graduation of 2023, we'll see what the numbers are for 24, but graduation 2023, 42% of all bachelor's degrees were awarded to men. The rest were women.
Wow.
Right? So men are disappearing from higher education. All master's degrees. So, well, I shouldn't say all. I'll rephrase. The majority of all master's degrees and doctoral degrees are now women.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So law degrees, PhDs, doctors, master's degrees, and all sorts of things, subjects from education to psychology, etc. Mostly women. You see more gender parity in STEM, if not majority men in STEM. That throws off the data quite a bit. But in the humanities and social sciences, it's dominated primarily by women.
Okay.
So we're also having a crisis in terms of women in their late teens and 20s who are, like I said earlier, right, driven. They have capacity. They're really smart. They're really attractive, right? They're dialed in. They're focused. They can't find men.
Yeah.
Right. So on the one hand, if you are asking a 23-year-old and she's like, well, I can't find any men, she's not exaggerating.
Yeah.
Right. She's not just making this up. She actually probably can't find a lot of men with whom she's intellectually compatible.
Right.
Right. Who also has the same aspirations and dreams and capacity as she does, because they're actually, unfortunately, simply disappearing. So now we're having a marriage problem, right? So women are having to, in some cases, and I've seen this, unfortunately, they're settling and marry men that they probably wouldn't have married otherwise, but there just aren't any.
There's no options.
There's just not a lot of good men available. When you add all of those things up, and when you look at the suicide data right now, so young men between the ages of 15 and 24, 4 times the suicide rate as women.
It's staggering.
We also see the suicide spike for men between the age of 45 and 54. It's also gone way up. Those two cohorts right now are particularly worrisome. You look at the opioid crisis right now, predominantly men. You add all these things together, we have a major crisis in this country. And this is not an exaggeration, but it's also not new. We began to see this happen in the late 1990s, and it was really conservatives who were raising the red flags, and everybody was just dismissive, right? They're like, well, it's not a real crisis because look at the percentage of CEOs at Fortune 500 companies that are men. Therefore, there's no boy crisis. And a bunch of us who actually worked with young adults and teens were like, no. Like, there's a crisis. We're waving our hands saying, hey, guys, there's something wrong. And that wave is finally crashing on multiple institutions. And a lot of people are worried. I really do feel bad for parents who are struggling to try to figure out what to do with their sons because they don't know how to motivate them. And a lot of them have just resigned. Dr. Karen Ornay's work, she was a psychiatrist in New York City. She has a book called Toward Neurosis and Growth. And she talks about this scenario where guys get so discouraged. She says they have their wings clipped at some point in their development. They just resign. They check out. They pledge allegiance to just being left alone. So what do they want to do? They're not driven. They're not ambitious. They just want to be left alone to live their lives according to whatever interests them. They don't want to be
Hmm.
bothered. They don't want to be drawn into a relationship that might demand something of them. You might think about it in a more contemporary setting. They just kind of want to play video games and smoke a lot of weed and hook up with girls every now and then, and maybe DoorDash,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
But just leave them alone. Don't
Okay.
bother me. Don't ask me to do anything. Just let me live my life, and I'll be fine. This level of resignation might explain why we're seeing workforce participation decline. It also may be in part why we're seeing the college enrollment rates decline for men as well.
Hmm. Okay. That's helpful. Because you used the word earlier that men are disappearing. Would you say they're just disappearing into this resignation? And what aspect does mental health issues or mental health illness play in that as well? Are those kind of hand in hand? Or is the resignation, do you think, an escape or a coping mechanism for mental health issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it's all of the above. I
Yeah.
think one of the things that we're seeing, and this is just with Gen Zers in general, younger millennials,
Right.
we're just seeing spikes. The whole generation cohort, the whole cohort is struggling with anxiety and
Yeah.
depression and substance abuse and things like that, just as a cohort. And what tends to happen is that boys and girls tend to manage those anxieties and tensions differently.
Mm-hmm.
Boys tend to act out with those
Okay.
things. Women tend to act inwardly, right?
Okay.
So a guy is much more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol or lose himself in a video game. A girl might more likely to have an eating disorder or cut herself or something like that,
Yeah.
right? Take some pills or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. So what's different about the resignation that we saw in previous iterations of sort of cultural patterns is that the internet exists.
Mm-hmm.
And what
Right.
the internet does is say, hey, if you're struggling, if you want to resign, it's www.resign, .here. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that could be serial watching shorts on YouTube, watching
Mm-hmm.
YouTube videos of X, Y, and Z. You're constantly scrolling on Instagram or TikTok or Yik Yak or Snapchat. Are you doing something like that? But the internet provides space for young men to resign into. So
Mm-hmm.
you can play video games for 4 or 5 hours a day and be checked out of making contributions to the common good. So these sorts of opportunities to resign didn't exist 50 years ago. You just had
Right.
to go do something, but
Yeah.
now you don't. And that's in part because we're about to see the greatest wealth transfer in American history between the boomers and their children and grandchildren. So that allows a lot of young men to do nothing because they're subsidized by the wealth of their parents and or
Mm.
grandparents. There's a failure to launch
Yeah.
because this adolescence in some respects is delayed and supported. So there is massive mental health issues, massive rates of depression and anxiety. And one of the ways, there are really three ways that Dr. Orne says that people, especially men, tend to handle these sorts of anxieties, this sort of uncertainty about themselves, the confusion about where they fit into the world. She says that basically you tend to become like a narcissist.
Okay.
You act out toward people. You try to dominate. You're vindictive. You want to win at all costs. You become
Mm.
the CEO. You become the class president. You conquer your anxiety and your depression and your
Interesting.
uncertainty. You just win, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna white knuckle and win and gonna beat it. Secondly, she says that you tend to become a doormat, right?
Mm.
You have these uncertainties and you want somebody else to just make the decisions for you and lead your life.
Hmm.
You are drawn to love. You think that if you're just in a relationship with someone, they will lead your life. And so a lot of men who are people pleasers get connected with women that are narcissists, and the women
Interesting.
basically control many aspects of their lives, and they're
Yeah.
perfectly happy to have somebody be almost like another mother to them.
Yeah.
Right. But they're chronic people pleasers. And the third way, which is what I'm seeing more dominantly today, is just resignation.
Okay.
Just absolutely saying, you know what? I don't know who I am. My confidence is low. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. I have all these issues. I don't know where I fit in. I'm out. Right. I'm just going to completely check out. And what happens is you develop this sense of this person that you need to become in order to have a good life. And you either are going to try to become that in terms of an aspiration, or you think it's so ridiculous that you're just completely discouraged and you do nothing.
Yeah. So is the resignation, you think, coming out of this condemnation that they can just never get to where they need to be? Or yeah, and I don't know. I guess that's my question. Is it from condemnation, do you think?
Yeah. So what we're seeing right now is this resignation, I think, comes from a couple of sources. One is internal.
Okay.
There's just a lot of, I would say there's a crisis of self-confidence.
Yeah.
Okay. And that self-confidence is crucial for risk-taking. For example, most recent data I saw is that 58% of young men between the age of 15 and 24 have never approached a woman. Like they've never asked a girl out, never asked for a number, never said hello in person. 58%.
That's
now over 70% of women say they prefer a guy to walk up to her in person rather than something like a text message, a DM on Instagram, or a dating app. They prefer that face-to-face, but guys aren't doing it. If you ask guys why they aren't doing it, you try to get a couple of answers. One is they don't feel confident to do that because they don't want to experience potential rejection.
Right.
If you have low self-confidence, you are not going to do things that are going to open you up to being wounded, and particularly, right, being rejected. But then secondly, and this relates to my second point here as well, they don't want to be considered creepy or or like a perv.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Now, how does that uniquely transitions to the second point? So on the one hand, there's a lack of self-confidence, but on the other hand, boys have grown up in a country. I mean, if they're 25 years old right now, they've been told that being a boy is bad, that being a male is bad and toxic, right? And so they've had a whole narrative growing up, especially if they were in a public school, that being male and becoming a man is potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
Right? That you're going to potentially hurt a woman, potentially hurt some kids, potentially hurt society, because that's what men have done. Men have made the world a bad place. And if you've heard a narrative that men are always the problem, then what happens is that they just kept getting beat down and beat down and beat down. And so what a lot of young guys have done is this: well, if being a male is toxic, then I just won't do anything.
Yeah.
Right? If being ambitious is dangerous, then I won't have ambition. If being aggressive is bad, then I won't be aggressive.
Yeah.
Right? If being a doormat and a people pleaser is what you want, well, I don't want to be that either. So I'm just going to do my own thing. Just leave me alone.
Yeah.
Let me play video games. I'll smoke some weed. And then if I found a girl to hook up with, I'll do that. If they are even doing that, right? We're seeing trends downward in terms of adolescent and young adult sex, which I think is actually a good thing. But we're also seeing declines in things like young men getting driver's licenses. We're seeing declines in, like I said, job rates, college enrollment, all of these declines. They don't hang out anymore. They basically, and this is partly facilitated by smartphones and social media, they stay at home.
Yeah.
right? They
Right.
just stay at home, and they can stay at home because they can afford to stay at
To do
home
that. Yeah.
because they live in comfort. Now, what's really interesting, this is my last point on this one. What's really interesting is that the this is so counterintuitive, is that the young men who are struggling the most are the upper middle class kids,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So this is really, really crazy data. Madeline Levine talked about this in The Price of Privilege in 2000, I want to say 6. There's a new book that just came out called Never Enough. And I can't.
That's excellent. I just read that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so she reiterates some of Levine's data,
Okay.
and the most at-risk youth in America, the preteens and teens that have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, somatic complaints, which is impairment due to stress, things like that. Like I can't get up, I can't walk, my stomach hurts, my back hurts, all those sorts of things. They have the highest rates of these things of any group of kids in America.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Right? So all the parents who are doing what they can to make sure their kids have everything, these are the boys who are struggling the most. One of the things I've seen in the fraternity stuff I've done is that the lads who were committing suicide on campuses and drug overdosing are to my surprise these well-adjusted, overachieving guys in fraternities, which is also somewhat counterintuitive. They're just struggling, no matter if they are high performing or low performing. They just don't have they don't believe they have a place in the world.
Do you think this has something to do with having our categories of sin messed up? It's almost as if it's being portrayed or communicated by the world that manhood is a sin in and of itself. Is that an issue, do you think? And then also I do just think it's interesting that we live in such a secular world, obviously, and I was just listening to something this morning about how the solutions in the Enlightenment and onward seemed like we just needed to get out from under the condemnation of God. Like if we just weren't condemned by God, we would be okay. We'd be free. But that obviously, I mean, everything you just presented points to the fact that that's not true, because these young men, and we know young people in particular, are feeling a weight of condemnation that is obviously very real to them. So I'm curious, that was a lot there, but curious on your thoughts about the sin categories, and then kind of what, how the law is at play, even when it's outside of the Christian context.
Yeah, those are great questions. I think what's happened inadvertently is a sort of pseudo-gnosticism, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, where evil, sin, like evil, the world of the demonic, right? Like real evil, is located in something in the creation itself, right? It's not sourced from the devil, right? Doesn't come from Satan. It's something that God made that's evil.
Yeah.
So what's evil is being masculine. That's a form of Gnosticism, because you're placing the evil in something in the creation instead of identifying the actual source of real evil, which is the devil.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So you have that, which opens up, I think, a lot of guys to a sense of shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So guilt is, you feel some remorse, you're downcast because you did something really bad. You did something wrong. Right. Yeah. I stole my next door neighbor's pickup truck and I drove it into a tree. I feel guilty for that.
Yeah.
Shame is worse. It basically says that there's something about my constitution. There's something about the way I'm made. Like there's something like I am bad. I am distorted. I am deficient. Someone needs to offer recall on me. I'm that defective.
Right.
Right. And so I fundamentally believe that this is anthropological in nature as well. So you might think about it this way. in terms of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and I've been talking about this for quite some time, this has a lot to do with our anthropology. When you look at your sons, do you see them first and foremost in terms of Genesis chapter 3? Or when you look at your sons, do you see them first and foremost in terms of Genesis 1 and 2?
Interesting, yeah.
Because if you see them first and foremost in terms of Genesis 1 and 2, that they were made in God's image. They've been given capacity to rule and subdue and cultivate. They've been put in the garden to do good things. That God said that their creation was good. That you can look at your sons and you can smile as God smiles on them and celebrate their existence. And you look forward to the ways in which their humanity, as it's nurtured by the sacraments, right? As it's nurtured by the gospel, as it's nurtured by the scriptures, as it's nurtured by God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, as God raises up your sons, they are going to do great things because they bear the image and likeness of God. And so when you see their sin and you see when you get frustrated with them, right? When they do bad things, you're looking at them primarily as image bearers who have a sin problem, rather than looking at them as just a sin problem.
Yeah.
And somehow you have to figure out a way for them not to be just sinners, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that they're simultaneously sinful and justified. It's that they're just a bunch of distorted, messed up, broken, sinful people. And Lord have mercy, help me try to figure out a way for them not to kill everybody.
Right.
Right. Because if their base humanity is unleashed, the world is going to be a terrible place.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and I think in some cases, in some contexts, the secular culture's anthropology, as it relates to particularly masculinity, is that it is just inherently bad. Like too much masculinity is dangerous. But if you look at it from the perspective of Genesis 1 and 2, we want more masculinity, not less, because masculinity, when it's unleashed for its intended purpose, by definition, same thing goes for women, does great things because it bears God's image, right? So this is why we want to think about the ways in which both the law shapes who we are, our understanding of the gospel in terms of it freeing us from the penalties of sin, and God inviting us to be the types of men and women who are involved in the things that God is involved in both the church and in society where possible. So it gives a sense of mission. It gives a sense of meaning. There's this, you're brought into transcendence, right? Yeah. Because you're uniquely connected to the ways in which the Trinity is working in your life, in the life of your husband, in the life of your kids, in the life of your family and your church, etc. But when we see, if we fundamentally see manhood, masculinity, boys as nothing but toxic and bad, and they need to be fixed, I think that narrative is something that it's a prevailing narrative in the West that boys are born bad and we need to fix them.
Yeah.
Right. Nancy Pearcey has a great book called, it's something about toxic masculinity. I think it's, oh my gosh, maybe the history of toxic masculinity, something like that. But if you look up Nancy Pearcey and toxic masculinity, the book will come up. She kind of gives the history of how we got here. And we follow each other on Twitter, and at some point, I can't remember, I found this cover page of a magazine in Australia, and the cover had a boy on it. I mean, this boy was probably 4 or 5 years old, and the article title read something like this: "How to Keep Him from Becoming a Monster."
Oh my gosh.
Right? So that's how we look at boys. We look at boys as potential monsters. So I just believe that fundamentally this is anthropological in nature, that's at the root of this, and somewhat Gnostic. So we think of evil in terms of roles and genders. We don't think of evil or even the demonic in terms of how those can operate in a person regardless of their gender. So we tell a story of a bunch of bad men, but we also often don't tell the story of a bunch of good men, and sometimes that's also missing.
Okay. Where you alluded to this a little bit, but I want to get more into it because this is what I was specifically really interested in. You were writing about on your Substack. Where does the cross come into play in how we are meant to view, as Christians, we are meant to view young men and men in general? Where does the cross come into play? And then a follow-up question would be, I want to get into kind of your argument that you think the Christus Victor articulation of the gospel is specifically helpful for men. I don't know if the same is true for how we view men. It might be, but first, kind of, what does the cross have to say about how we view men, and then what does Christus Victor do? Give men in particular?
Yeah, great question. And I would say that the cross, by definition, doesn't give anything to men that it doesn't give to women.
Yes, thank you. That's
right.
Very important. Yeah.
Right. So it's not that the work of Christ is gendered.
Right.
Because what the Bible does not do, I want to be very clear on this. The Bible does not set masculinity opposite to femininity. It doesn't set being a man opposite to being a woman. It actually sets masculinity in terms of maturity.
Okay.
In terms of growth. In terms of being spiritually mature.
Okay.
In terms of, like in Hebrews, going from milk to meat. Right. In fact, and I got this from an LCMS pastor, Jeffrey Hemmer. He has a book called Man Up, which I would highly, highly recommend.
Okay.
Jeffrey Hemmer, you should have him on your podcast about this topic. He's really fantastic. He's an LCMS pastor in either one of the I states, Illinois or Indiana. I can't remember which one, but he has a great book published by Concordia Press, Man Up. And one of the distinctions that he makes is what it means to be effeminate. If you look at the Greek word, So what Paul talks about in terms of the Greek word that he uses for effeminate in Corinthians isn't really what we use the word for today.
Okay.
So to be effeminate is to be a person of low moral character. It's to be a person of low morals. And so what Paul is rebuking is immaturity. Right?
Yeah.
He's not rebuking what I consider cross-dressing or something like that. That's not the point, right? And like I said, Jeffrey Hemmer does a masterful job of covering this in the book Man Up. We talked about what Malachi actually means. It basically is spiritual immaturity and low morals.
Okay.
Right. So the cross really does. I would think about it this way. What the cross does for all of us is it frees us by the power of the Holy Spirit to be the kinds of people that God originally designed and intended us to be.
Yeah.
We can't do that. We can't be truly human as designed in Genesis 1 and 2 without some kind of transformation. It is impossible, right? We have to be changed because of the nature of sin. We have to be changed from the inside by the work of the Spirit directly to become the people that God wants us to be. There is no other way to do it.
Yeah.
And so for both men and women, what the cross does in part does lots of things, but one of the things it does is it frees us. I mean, I've just found it really, really fascinating in so much of Luther's writings. He talked about the sort of victory over sin and death and the devil, in his reflections on on the Apostles' Creed in the larger catechism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Luther has this comment: the sinner, he says, quote, had been captive under the power of the devil. He said about himself, I was condemned to death and entangled in sin and blindness, and the devil came and led us into disobedience, sin, death, and misfortune. I mean, he sort of continues that we lay under God's wrath and displeasure, sentenced to eternal damnation as we had merited and deserved it. There were no resources, no help, no comfort for us until this only and eternal Son in his unfathomable goodness had mercy on us because of our misery and distress and came from heaven to help us. Luther says, this is in the Book of Concord, the tyrants and the jailers had been routed and their place had been taken by Christ, the Lord of life, righteousness and every good thing and every blessing. He has snatched us, poor lost creatures, from the jaws of hell, won us, made us free, and restored us to the Father's favor and grace. As his own possession, he has taken us under his protection and shelter in order that we may rule, that he may rule us by his righteousness, wisdom, power, and blessedness. Right? And these are all the things that Luther says the cross did for us. He freed us, right? From sin and death and all misfortune and the devil. And in that section 434 to 435 of the Book of Concord, as that reflection on the Apostles' Creed is, I think, really, really important, because I think what it does is it broadens out what this is all about. Right? Okay. So it broadens the cross out beyond personal piety.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Can you tell me a little bit more what you mean by that? I want to make sure people get that.
Yeah. So here's what I mean. It broadens out the life of it. I'll say it this way. It broadens the Christian life beyond simply my personal holiness and righteousness at home and within the walls of my church.
Okay.
Right. So what it does, it says, this is actually my righteousness and my holiness, and God sanctifying me, God making me into the son or daughter that he wants me to be by the work of the Spirit. The sorts of things that we read about in Colossians chapter 3, about being kind and generous and things like that, the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5, those are the sorts of things that the Lord wants me to become, and that the cross brought me into, so that I can love my neighbor.
Right. Yeah.
And love my neighbor well. And loving your neighbor means, right? Think about it in terms of this great command that Christ gave to love God and love neighbor. Loving my neighbor takes me out of my house.
Yeah.
It takes me out of my church.
Takes me out of my phone.
Yes.
And the condemnation, whether rightly or wrongly I feel from the world. Yeah.
Right. And you also become a participant.
Yeah.
In whatever God is doing in the world to right things according to his will, because it all belongs to him. So I've been really struck by this passage in 1 John 3:8, where John makes this, he gives this reminder that Jesus came to undo the work of the devil. And as I think about the life of the disciples when they were with Christ for those 3 years, they were undoing the devil's work. They were loving their neighbor by engaging in casting out demons, and they were also engaged in healing disease. And all of those things were being done because they were pointing people to the lordship of Christ.
Yeah.
Over all things.
And the promises of Christ.
Absolutely.
Because the devil's work is often, I think, to snatch us from the fact that we are kept in God's promises. And yeah, I think I don't want to cut you off too much, but this insistence on freedom, that we are free from that as the ultimate promise. We're not going to know that in this life, but it is our promise, and we can hold on to it. I think is very, very helpful, especially in light of everything the problems you've been talking about.
Yeah, and when you think about the applications of what that means for someone who has a theology of the cross, is that I am a man or a woman who represents righteousness and holiness wherever I am.
Yeah.
So because of the cross, I cannot be someone who stands by and does nothing while children are being trafficked in India. I can't stand by and allow children to be poorly educated. I cannot stand by and allow people who are living in poverty to starve to death. I just can't do that. If all of this stuff is true, then I can't turn a blind eye to the things that the devil is trying to do in the world, because my Christ came to undo all of that, and I'm being enlisted in that ongoing work. The work of Christ at undoing the work of the devil did end.
Yeah. Okay.
At the resurrection. It's still going on.
Right.
So Christ came to undo the work of the devil, and Christ is still undoing the work of the devil. Like you said, what part of the devil's work is to tell lies, and the father of lies. He's the father of lies, right? So Christ's ongoing work is to communicate truth to his people and to the world.
Yeah.
So when we communicate truth to the world, we are undoing the devil's work, because he's lying to people and deceiving people. And I think one of the great benefits of understanding this broadened scope of having victory over sin and death and the devil is that you realize that you're being brought into this really cosmic mission. This is something huge, and it gets you out of navel gazing about yourself.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, think about in the Christian tradition what this unlocked. This created the university.
Yeah.
Was a Christian invention. This invented hospitals. This invented orphanages. This invented adoption.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this invented children. Like children became people. Because of this framework, right? And so one of the things that I've been talking about lately as it relates to men who are resigned is that you've been invited to love your neighbor, which means that you have an opportunity to, as far as the curse is found, wherever that may be in your life, it could be in your neighborhood, it could be at work, to be an agent of holiness and righteousness, or to think about it in more missional terms. You're undoing the devil's work wherever you see it, right? You picking up trash off the street.
Yeah.
Right? You're protecting children in your neighborhood. You're fighting for marriages in your neighborhood. You're trying to get drugs off the street in your neighborhood. You're showing hospitality to strangers. You're sharing the gospel with people. You're inviting people to church. Like wherever you are, wherever you see the curse, wherever you see the devil's work, you're actually engaged in that type of work. So like, bros, like we got work to do, right? There's a lot of work to do. And there's a lot of, and by the way, the world needs you, right? The as it says in Romans 8, the creation's groaning, it's waiting for the sons of God to be like what? Released and unlocked. And I'm like, guys, let's go. Right? Put your video game down for a while. You can go back to it later. Okay. But we got some work to do. And I just see so many guys who just don't think they have any meaning, that they matter.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I would say that this framework does in terms of having victory over sin and death and the devil, it just provides a real sense of meaning. If you go back and read what Luther says in the book of a Concord, I mean, if we're being ruled by righteousness and wisdom and power and life and blessedness, what's it for? Right?
Right.
Like the tyrants, he says, the tyrants and jailers have been routed away from us by Jesus Christ. For what?
Yeah.
Right? There's no wrath. God doesn't see us like that. There's no displeasure. That's not the disposition now. There's no eternal damnation. We don't deserve it. It's not merited to us. But for what? We've been given mercy. For what? We've been taken from the jaws of hell, made free by Christ, restored, he says, to God's favor and grace. But for what? Just so that we can sit at home and praise God for that? No, there's stuff to do.
Yeah, I think that's where I think this specifically the idea of victory over death becomes really important, and this metaphor of justification being a move from death to life, because then when you're describing for people, you are alive in Christ and you've already been named alive. And this is what life looks like. Life looks like serving your neighbor in freedom, which means you're loving them and you're doing what is needed, and which is not turning a blind eye, as you mentioned. I think it also kind of reorients us from the always present need to navel gaze and say, well, if I'm not doing it, because it's so easy for us to then turn that declaration right back around and be like, well, if I'm not doing it, then I must not be a Christian, or I'm condemned. And so when you're giving people instead like this broad picture of life and how they're connected to everybody, I think that is also really, really helpful. I found that helpful personally as well. And at the same time, knowing that life given to you means constantly, as we would probably say as Lutherans, the old man is being put to death. Sin is always being put to death. That is the work of the promise, just as much as it is giving you new life. They're happening at the same time.
And God can use that in multiple spaces. I think for some it may be considered small, and others it could be big, right? So
exactly.
So it means that for some people they might end up being a Supreme Court justice. For others, that might end up being a sanitation worker.
Yeah.
But it's all good,
Mm-hmm.
right? For some people, the sphere in which this may materialize just may literally be in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
With their actual next door neighbors and
or
the people across the street.
Kids. Like
yeah, that's where I was going next.
Yeah.
Or in your home.
Right.
I mean, one of the reasons that I focus so much on helping guys in college get ready for marriage and fatherhood, because being a good dad, being a great husband is one of the most important things a man can ever do for society.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? Who is in prison? Who is in juvenile detention?
Yeah.
It is primarily young men who were victims of dad deprivation.
Yeah.
And so society pays.
Yeah.
Right? We're paying $35,000 or $50,000 a year, depending on your state, per inmate per year because of a broken family.
Right.
So when you're being a great dad, a great mom, a loving parent, a parent who does catechesis, you're making a massive contribution to the common good for multiple generations.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't need to be grandiose. And I think this is one of the problems. We saw this with the kind of change the world phraseology from like the 2000s, right? You got to do something.
I'm a millennial, big. So that's my whole jam.
Yeah, it's like a twitch. You get triggered, like change the world. You're like, oh my gosh,
please,
not that again, not that again, right? Yeah. And I think it was well intended, but unfortunately, as it says in 1 Thessalonians 4:11, to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and to work with your hands, like you can change the world by making it your ambition to live a quiet life and to work with your hands and to mind your own business. Like that changes the world just as greatly as becoming the president of the United States. If every Christian just did First Thessalonians 4:11, that would change the world.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And so this idea that, well, it's got to be something newsworthy, has to be something that on the outside that people see and they're impressed with, is absolute rubbish. That's just not how the kingdom works. Like, God uses his people wherever they are to do good things, and being freed from hell, from the snares of the devil, from the penalty of sin, being freed from condemnation, liberates God's people to be what he intends them to be.
Yeah.
That's always been from Israel to the present. That's always been what God has provided for his people, a means by which they can become what he has called them to be. Wherever they are in the world. In the Old Testament, they were roaming around the desert, right? Showing the other nations what it means to be the people of God. And we're doing the exact same thing today. We're in our neighborhoods, in our communities, we're at work, and we're putting on display before the world, when you are with your kids in a park, right? You're displaying before the world what it means to be God's people. And people hopefully will look at you and be like, man, I want that. I want a marriage like that, right? To have some middle school girls around you, you and your husband, your kids, be like, man, I want a family like this. What is it about you guys? So tell me what's different about you. You want your next door neighbors to see, like, man, I come over to your house and your kids are happy, and they're happy and crying, and happy and crying, and you guys are laughing, and there's a grace here and there's a mercy here. Like, what's going on in here?
Yeah.
Right. And those are some of the things that we want to invite people to do and to be and to put on display.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that comes from this declaration of righteousness that you are already, which seems so important to combating the shame that you've talked about. Because when you are no longer what the world says you are, or what you feel internally, or what you've experienced, you are actually righteous. You are going to, that's going to flow out of you. And you don't even have to then at that point worry about measuring it. It's just going to happen. And I think the times that it's so crazy, because I struggle with perfectionism. I'm kind of the typical girl you described, like, work hard, I'm going to be the smartest, whatever. So I understand very innately what it means to be checking my fruit and checking my righteousness and making sure I look that way to other people. But the times that stick with me most profoundly, of people saying, like, this thing that you did changed me, or a friend one time said, the way that your marriage, I viewed your marriage, saved my marriage. I didn't do anything. I was not doing anything. I can fully and confidently say that. And so I think that that's what an amazing guarantee for the people of God to know, out of this declaration of righteousness that is ours, all of these amazing things are going to just flow freely. That's been helpful for me.
Yeah, and it should make sense why absolution is where it is in the liturgy. Like, where is that? When does absolution happen in the liturgy?
At the end,
right? So you leave having partaken of the Eucharist, right? You leave having had communion, having had the Lord's Supper. You leave absolved of your sins.
Yeah.
With this sense that you are right. Your position with God has been righted. Yeah. It is now good and righteous. And so you are free, really free, truly free by the work of the Holy Spirit. Okay. You are truly free to be the man that God wants you to be. You're free to be the woman that God wants you to be. You are actually free to love God and to love neighbor.
Hmm.
And you're exactly right. And you don't have to measure your righteousness by your works.
Right.
Right? You're not building up your spiritual resume to impress God or to feel a sense of your standing with God or to feel that you're making a contribution to the church and the world. It's not about the resume that you've done. You're actually doing those things because you've received mercy. You're now free to do that because, in one sense, you don't care about the consequences.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You don't care. So if I die, I die. Death has no sting. Big deal. Right? If they hate me, they hate me. Jesus said they're going to hate me. Big deal.
Yeah.
Right? If I end up making less money, I make less money. God's got me.
Right.
Right? You're just free. You're just really, really free to love God and love neighbor. If my family thinks I'm crazy, they think I'm crazy. Right? But I am still cared for. I'm still known. I'm still connected. Like there's nothing that's going to change that as far as the East is from the West. I mean, there's nothing that can. Yeah, I mean, this is really good news. There's nothing that can separate me from the love of God. Like being a Christian ought to be a life of celebration and joy, right? Like if you really understand what this means, your neighbors should wonder why you throw so many parties. Right? Why is it that when they walk past your house on Saturday at 7:00, they just hear laughter with you and your friends and all these? I mean, why you guys just have fun all the time? What's up? Sundays, you guys just come back, you bring people, and you just celebrate and laughing. What is this about? Right? This is what happens when you really understand the power of this. And unfortunately, I think because of things like perfectionism, because of the resume building, because of the resignation, we have a lot of young people who don't have a vision for how and why they matter.
Exactly.
And so they're constantly trying to create these artificial ones. I honestly think that part of the social contagion we're seeing on college campuses with the pro-Palestinian protest has a lot to do with a void, with a meaning void, a purpose void, and a void in mattering.
Right.
Right? Yeah. There's something inherent to what Jesus says about the kingdom that gives you a meaning system. It gives you transcendence. It gives you all that you need to know that you matter. So you can hold all of these things really loosely because ultimately you know that everything about you is grounded in something deeper, transcendent, and eternal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great word. Well, I feel like we could continue talking for another hour, but I know your time is limited. So I want to wrap it up. Dr. Bradley, where can we find your work and what have you been working on? We didn't even really get to Heroic Fraternities, which I think is your most recent book, but tell us kind of what you've been working on lately and where we can go to find more of your work.
Yeah, I'm easily found. You can just Google Anthony Bradley and you can find me. That's good and bad.
Yeah.
But I've got some books on Amazon. My most recent book is on heroic fraternities. The subtitle is how college men can save universities and America. If you want an example of that, it's the Pi Kappa Phi fraternity at UNC Chapel Hill holding up the American flag.
Yeah,
that would be an example of what I'm talking about there. They are the counter protesters across the Deep South right now. And in that fraternity work, I'm really interested. It really dovetails from this conversation. I'm interested in college fraternities being factories of virtue rather than factories of vice, and inviting men to become excellent men of virtue. And I can tell you briefly here that when I travel to college campuses and I talk to young men in fraternities about being men of virtue, who make contributions to the world that are good, they all enthusiastically enlist. I have never been to a college campus. I have not been to one college campus or one fraternity anywhere in America. And I've been doing this for a couple of years now, 3 years now, where I have not had a fraternity be enthusiastic about doing something virtuous and good for their communities and their campuses. Not even one. They want to be great men, but they
That's
don't know
awesome.
how. They don't know how. There's no roadmap,
Okay.
and so that's part of the fraternity work. Future work, I'll be working. I've got two things going. One, I'm working on a study guide on the Book of Exodus, and then secondly, I'm currently having some discussions with a publisher about a book on fatherhood. It's a book not on how to be a dad. It's a book on the consequences of fatherlessness.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This has been super enlightening. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcasts. If you like the Outside Ourselves podcast, I would love if you could give a 5-star rating wherever you're listening and or subscribe on YouTube. Those are some really quick and easy ways to get the word out about Outside Ourselves. I'd also love to hear from you. If you have a question for a guest or a question about an episode, I know a lot of times we don't get to everything that I would like to in these conversations. And when I re-listen to them, I know there's always things that could be clarified for people. So if you ever have a question, I would love to hear from you. Or just leave a comment on the Kelsi Cumbera YouTube channel, and I do my best to get back to as many of those as I can. Thanks so much for listening, as always, and I will see you back here in a couple of weeks.